Good. Well, it's good to see your faces, even if I'm seeing them from a distance. Really glad to be back home and glad to be with you guys again. Uh, and looking forward to picking up on Zechariah. Uh, by the way, Cheryl, you asked me about the difference between Zechariah and Zechariah, whether it's an A or an E, and I went down a rabbit hole trying to figure that out. And the best I could find out was that it's just a difference in the translators. Uh, Apparently, it's the same name, it's just translated differently in different places. So, if any of you find out something different from that, well, let me know. But uh, best resources I can find, just put it down to translation. So we're looking at Zechariah with an E uh, now, and we're about halfway through Zechariah. You'll recall that this is a series titled "Called to Persevere," and I think there are a good many direct lessons for us in this study. So we'll draw them out as we go, and then maybe we'll do some wrap up at the end and draw conclusions as well. Um, I am always just intrigued by how pertinent the biblical text is. I don't know why I'm surprised by that. I should not be surprised, but every time I do a study like this, I'm in wonderment. So we have looked at the first 8 chapters of Zechariah. Zechariah being the prophet who started prophesying concurrently with Haggai. And you'll recall that the people had come to the land and they had gotten a good start, and then they'd gotten stopped in their progress. And for probably about 16 years, they didn't do any work on the temple. So the Lord came to Haggai and told the people, pay attention. You got to do this. Uh, Listen up. This is important. I want you to put me first and build my temple. So the people did. They repented and they started building again. And Zechariah then, while they were building, began to get messages from the Lord. And we talked about those 8 night visions he had. And we didn't try to do too much detail on them. We tried to get the big picture. Clearly, God was encouraging his people and meant those visions to be encouragement. Uh, we draw big principles from them, like God is in charge of what happens. God will take care of you. Justice will come for your enemies and for you as well. The future will be glorious. God has a plan. God cares about all nations. God promises to take away the sin that separates us. God can do great things with your small efforts, and God will triumph. Uh, Messages meant to inspire hope, confidence, trust. And then we got into the message about the priest that would be a king, and a promise that the line of David would continue as God had promised. Then, about 2 years later, after they've been building for a while, Zechariah gets a message from Babylon. You'll remember this. This is in chapter 7. We're going to review just a little bit chapter 7 and 8 here. So here's this message that comes from Babylon, and it's the people who stayed in Babylon, and they're asking, well, we hear that you're getting close to finishing the temple, that you're working on it, and there's going to be a temple. So all these fasts that we've been doing, commemorating the destruction of the temple and praying for the rebuilding of the temple, do we stop these fasts? Which, that seems like a reasonable question to me. We've been doing this faithfully for 70 years. So is it time to stop? Is this a moot point now? And the Lord's answer is interesting. One of the commentators I read said, you ask God one question and you get a much bigger answer. So he asks them, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months for the past 70 years, was it really for me you fasted? One thing that I ran across this just the last couple of days when I was studying is at least one commentator says these fasts that they were doing while they were in exile had not been commanded by God. This was something that, maybe the priests came up with. I thought that was an interesting tidbit. But God, talks to them about how the earlier prophets have already spoken to you about your rituals. Then down in verse 8, you get the word of the Lord coming to Zechariah. This is what the Lord Almighty said: administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other. That sounds a whole lot like I desire mercy and not sacrifice, from Hosea, or act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God from Micah. This is not anything new that God's been telling them. He's been telling them, yes, be faithful, do the things I've asked you to do, but your heart is what is important. How you treat people is what's important. And so God says this thing again to them. Another thing that I ran across just in the last couple of days or two is verse 11. God says the Israelites refused to pay attention. Stubbornly, they turned their backs and covered their ears. They made their hearts as hard as flint and would not listen to the law or the words of the Lord Almighty. That phrase there, they turned their backs, depending on what version you're looking at. In some versions, it says they turned their shoulder, or sometimes the translators say they turned a stubborn shoulder. And one of the sources I was reading said this is the source of giving someone a cold shoulder, which I thought was fun and interesting. But this is the reaction to the people when God tells them that it's their hearts that are important. They are stubborn and they don't follow his direction. Okay, so then we get to chapter 8. Sometimes this chapter 8 is called, I don't know what the heading in your Bible says. The one that I'm using here is an NIV from Bible Gateway, and it says, "The Lord promises to bless Jerusalem." Some of the other headings are like 10 promises of blessing. And there's a promise in verses 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, 14, 19, 20, and 23. Everywhere it starts off and says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. So you get 10 of these. And when I was looking at this to review it, I was interested in what God is doing here. And the more I read it, the more this begins to sound, I think the heading I would put on it is this is a love letter to God's people. God is writing a love letter to them because he tells them how much he cares for them and how committed he is to them and how his plan for them is glorious. He has good things in mind for them. And so this is an interesting passage here. Um, I in verse 2 there, I'm very jealous for Zion. I'm burning with jealousy for her. I have, wrestled with that word jealousy because in my head, jealousy is a bad thing. So every time it says jealousy is, you know, the way God feels toward us, I have this visceral, reaction to that because when I was growing up, my mom told me, you don't want a jealous man because he will make your life miserable, He will not really love you the way you need to be loved. So that plays in my head. And so I was trying to figure out, is there another way to convey God's commitment to his people? Maybe I am very devoted to you. I burn with devotion, to you, something like that. Um, but he goes on and he makes all these promises. Verse 4 is one of my favorites. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each of them with cane in hand because of their age. I, I, I don't know why I'm attracted to a verse about old age. Figure that out for yourself. But it indicates that the people would not be dying at the hand of enemies. They would have the blessing of living to old age, which, in this time in history was not something you could assume. And then he says the city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there. It will be safe. Kids can play in the street. You don't have to worry about things. So this is a picture of rest. This is a picture of ease. This is a picture of having everything you need and being uh, satisfied. So then you get down in verse 7, and he's calling them my people again, which is a really welcome signal for them to hear him call them my people. Be my people, and I will be righteous to them as their God. And then in verse 9, he talks about the temple being built. It will be built. The remnant of the people will come through and reestablish the temple. And then down in verse 14, I don't know about you, but when I read just as I had determined to bring disaster on you and showed no pity when your ancestors angered me, that made me think of Hosea. One of Hosea's children is named No Pity. Uh, so that's an echo of previous messages. And then he says, do not be afraid. Speak the truth to each other and render true and sound judgment in your courts. Do not plot evil against each other and do not love to swear falsely. I hate all this, declares the Lord. Again, this very consistent message about their hearts and the way they treat each other. Then he comes back to the fasts about the question that was asked in chapter 7. The fasts of the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 10th months will become joyful and glad occasions, happy festivals for Judah. Therefore, love truth and peace. So the fasting will turn to feasting. And that is a symbol of um, good times. So, feasting with someone is universally accepted as an indication of good relationship. So if invite you over to dinner, you can assume that it's because I enjoy your company and want to spend time with you. We are at peace. We have relationship. And feasts were very often the culmination of a covenant, sealed a covenant of peace between two parties. So the fasting is an important thing. I mean, the feasting is an important thing. Um, and then at the end, there are a couple of promises that touch on the idea that God will welcome all nations. And this is a consistent message throughout the Old Testament. You get uh, God saying that he's going to bless Abraham, and through his seed, all nations will be blessed. And throughout the Old Testament, we have this message that God is seeking all people, not just his chosen people. His chosen people is where the blessing will come from, but it's for all. And so he talks about the idea that God's people will be the light of the world, and through them, the ultimate light of the world will come. So that brings us to Ezra 5. Yes, we're going back to Ezra. They've been building. Haggai called them, Zechariah called them. They've been rebuilding the temple, they've been working, but things aren't going smoothly. If you look at Ezra 5, there's a story about this governor in the region there by Jerusalem who starts asking questions. You see verse 3 in Ezra 5. Who authorized you to rebuild this temple? What are the names of those who are constructing this? And then it says in verse 5, but the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped. So Tattenai, I guess that's how you say his name. That's how I'll say it. Tattenai sends a letter to the king, to King Darius or Darius, however you say it. And you see the letter. Now remember, Ezra is a great one for collecting official documents and then weaving them into his story. So he has a copy here of the letter that Tattenai writes. And it starts in verse 7, to King Darius, cordial greetings. The king should know that we went to the district of Judah to the temple of the great God, and the people are building it with large stones and placing the timbers in the walls, and the work is being carried on with diligence and is making rapid progress under their direction. We questioned the elders and asked them, who authorized you to rebuild this temple and to finish it? We also asked them their names so we could write down the names of their leaders for your information. Great king, we're on your side. We are a loyal servant. We want you to know what's going on out here in the middle of nowhere. There are these people doing this thing, and we think you need to know about it. I think we've all worked with people like that, right? Who will go to the boss and say, just thought you ought to know that he, or that she, anyway. So they write about what answer the Israelites gave down in verse 11. The answer they gave us, we're the servants of the God of heaven and earth. We're rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, one that a great king of Israel built and finished. But because our ancestors angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar the Chaldean, the king of Babylon, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. I don't think I said it at the time, but Babylon is sometimes called Chaldea. So you may see Babylonians, you may see Chaldeans. those names are sort of interchangeable. And likewise, Persia is sometimes called the Achaemenid kingdom or empire. So you get Persia, you get Achaemenid, uh, multiple names for the same. And then the Jews went on and said, however, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, now you thought he was king of Persia, didn't you? All right. The kings of Persia conquered all of these countries. And so they assumed the name of the king of those areas. So when Cyrus conquered the Medes, he became the king of Media. When he conquered Babylon, he became the king of Babylon. And in fact, many historians call the Persian kings the king of kings because they're kings of all these different areas. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. He even removed from the temple of Babylon the gold and silver archives of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem and brought them to the temple in Babylon. Then King Cyrus gave them to a man named Sheshbazzar, whom he had appointed governor, and told him, take these articles and go and deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem and rebuild the house of God on this site. So Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem, and from that day to the present, it's been under construction, but is not yet finished. So the Jews tell Tattenai the whole story, and he writes it all down in his letter to King Darius. So Tattenai says, now if it pleases the king, let a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did in fact issue a decree to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem. Then let the king send us his decision in this matter. Now, you know the principle. If a king decrees something, then the kings that follow that decree, because a king's decree cannot be eliminated, cannot be rolled back. Whatever the king decrees, that stands. So, chapter 6, King Darius then issued an order, and they searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon. A scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media, and this was written on it. All right, so here's another memorandum that Ezra's gotten a copy of. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of the God of Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices, and let its foundations be laid. It is to be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, with 3 courses of large stones and 1 of timbers. Costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, are to be returned to their places in the temple in Jerusalem. They are to be deposited in the house of God. Now then, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and your other officials of that province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I hereby decree that you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. Their expenses are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury from the revenues of your area. Your tax money is going for this, so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat and salt and wine and olive oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. King Darius wants this, well, Cyrus originally, Darius now, wants the temple to be established so that the Jews will pray for him and his sons. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone defies this edict, a beam is to be pulled from their house, and they are to be impaled on it. And for this crime, their house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or destroy this temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. Let it be so. So Darius looked up the archive. Well, somebody for Darius got in the archives and looked it all up, saw what Cyrus had said, and then he reinforces it and tells Tattenai, you're supposed to be helping them, not hindering them. Which is a really interesting little side story that goes on while the people are now rebuilding the temple. Okay, now here's the exciting part. The heading of the next section in my Bible says completion and dedication of the temple. Okay. Then, because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tattenai, governor of the Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddu. They finished the building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the third day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Now, if you translate that, you get March 12th, 516 BC. So you remember Haggai started preaching in 520. So it took them 4 years now to rebuild the temple on the foundations that they had laid. Now this is a big darn deal. Oh, one thing. You notice it says decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is the king that comes after Darius. And apparently he was also still supporting the Jews, following what Cyrus and Darius had established. All right, now look at this, verse 16. Now, we've been picking up little bits and pieces about how the temple was reconstructed. So keep watching for clues about how it's built. Verse 16. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of this house of God, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 male lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And they installed the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their groups for the service of God at Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. Okay. I don't know if you'll recall, but way back when we were looking at who returned, remember it's just 2 tribes because we lost the north and the 10 tribes in the north. And we said that there were some people who returned from Babylon who could not trace their lineage. They couldn't prove who their ancestors were. And some of those who didn't have the paperwork for their family line, Ezra notes that they could not serve as priests until the temple was built and they were purified. So what we get here is circling back, and now all of the priests have been purified because the temple is the place of cleansing, and the priests clean themselves before they go in to represent the people. So there was a huge celebration and dedication. And then there's a paragraph after this that says they celebrated Passover. Now, this would have been very important to them. This would have been reestablishing their uh, relationship with God. On the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who returned from the exile ate it together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria. Remember, the king of Persia, the king of Assyria, the king of Babylon, the king of kings, so that he assisted them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. All right, we did it. We rebuilt the temple. Hooray! Now, what did this rebuilt temple look like? How did this rebuilt temple compare to the temple that Solomon had built? This is a question lost in the ages. We don't really know. We have a lot of detail about Solomon's temple. We have very little detail about the temple built by the remnant in the return. So I went down 10 million rabbit holes trying to find as much as I could find about this. Um, one detail for the OCD in the crowd. We've been saying 70 years, 70 years, 70 years exile. To me, the best uh, representation of that is the 70 years when the temple didn't exist. Remember, the Babylonians attacked in 606 and 695, 97, and then in 606 and 597. Then in 586, they were mad at the Jews because they tried to have an alliance with Egypt, and they came and they destroyed the city. They tore down all the walls, they tore down the temple, they burned it, they destroyed the whole business. Okay, so 586, when the temple's destroyed, and we just read 516, when the temple is completed. I think my math says that's 70 years. So if you're looking for 70 years, those look to me to be the best dates for that. Um, that's just Karen's guess. Okay, so in order to understand how this temple compares to the Temple of Solomon, if you go back and look at the Temple of Solomon, you can look in 1 Kings 8 when it was dedicated, 2 Chronicles 2. There's a lot of detail about Solomon's temple and the glories of it and the celebrations, the dedications, the um, uh, amazing aspects of Solomon's temple. One writer said there were 270 tons of gold and 575 tons of silver used in the temple. The interior of the Holy of Holies apparently was the walls were completely covered with gold. There was a bronze door that was the marvel of everyone who saw it. There were intricate carvings. It was a very elaborate building, and you can go on YouTube, and there are all kinds of YouTube presentations that give you a 3D representation of the Solomon temple. And it's pretty amazing. One, a couple of things that I ran across when I was looking at this. Uh, the temple was built to be twice the size of the tabernacle. I had not run across that before. I thought that was interesting. Also, Jerusalem was on a plateau, and there was a plateau above that one where the threshing floor was, because you wanted to thresh on the high spot so the wind would help you. And David bought that threshing floor up there as the site of the temple. And he gathered everything. And then, God told him his son would build the temple. So the city is at a lower elevation than the temple. Temple was raised above the city. Interestingly, when the Temple of Solomon was dedicated, we read how many animals were sacrificed in Jerusalem when the temple was rebuilt. When the Temple of Solomon was dedicated, it says there were so many animals sacrificed that they couldn't be counted. One of the commentators said probably thousands. So that's a difference. For years, commentators said the rebuilt temple was smaller, but most of the scholars today think the rebuilt temple is the same size as the original temple because it was built on the original foundations. So the rebuilt temple is, probably very similar in dimension and location to Solomon's. But, it sounded like such a good thing for all of the uh, belongings, all of the precious things to be returned by the Persians. They get everything back. And we went through that there's a huge long list of thousands of bowls and, precious things. One thing that you notice when you read that is in Solomon's temple, there were 10 gold lampstands, and there was only one lampstand returned. And so the rebuilt temple just has one lampstand. But probably the most important thing is now the Holy of Holies is empty. There is no ark in the Holy of Holies. The Ark of the Covenant is gone. There is no record of what happened to it. Even Indiana Jones doesn't know where the Ark of the Covenant is. There are lots of theories. Some say the Jews hid it. Others say it got destroyed. We don't know. There is an interesting verse in Jeremiah where, let's see, where's that verse? Jeremiah 3:16, where Jeremiah prophesies, you won't remember the ark and you won't rebuild the ark. I found that interesting. But there's no ark. Now, the original temple, the tradition is that it was built on the site of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, or not sacrificing Isaac, building the altar to sacrifice Isaac. And there is apparently an outcropping of stone there where Abraham built the altar. And the outcropping of stone is located, they built oriented the temple in such a way that it's in the Holy of Holies, and the Ark of the Covenant sat on that outcropping of rock. Well, now in the rebuilt temple, when you go in the Holy of Holies, there's just that outcropping of rock there. There's not an ark. So, and the cherubim whose wings guarded There's no cherubim there now. So they're missing a lot of pieces. They've got uh, this and that, but not the total uh, of what had once lived. And of course, as we said, they don't have the 12 tribes. They've only got a remnant of the people. So if they're missing the Ark of the Covenant, they're missing the tablets of the law, they're missing the manna, Aaron's rod, the mercy seat, the Urim and Thummim. They're missing all of those things. And another thing that's important, I think, is when Solomon's temple was dedicated, the temple was filled with the cloud of the glory of Jehovah, the Shekinah glory. That doesn't say anything here about that happening for this rebuilt temple. So let's see. Those are some random things that I ran across when I was looking up temple. Okay, I'll pause a minute and let you comment. Anybody have an observation or more information or uh, a thought about the differences between the old temple and the new temple or what this might mean for the people? Commentary from anybody?
Yes, it's commonly understood that the Wailing Wall was a remnant of Solomon's temple. How do our Jewish brethren justify that with the thought? How do they reconcile that with the thought that the Solomon's temple was completely destroyed, not one stone left on another, and then there was the rebuilt temple? But they earnestly believe that that's the remaining wall of Solomon's temple.
Well, Lawrence, based on what I read and my sources on YouTube, uh, the what we're going to talk a little bit more about the temple when we get to the end of this study, because we're going to talk about the post-exilic period briefly as an epilogue to the end of this. Um, what I read was okay, there's Solomon's temple. Now there's this rebuilt temple. And when Herod the Great gets appointed puppet king by the Romans, he does a building program and he expands the temple courts. What he does is he takes the temple down to its foundations, rebuilds it, and he not only that, he builds these huge retaining walls and expands the area of that mesa where the temple is built, that hilltop, and enlarges the temple courts by like twice as large. And the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, is a remnant, to use that word, a leftover of the King Herod temple, the fortification, well, not fortification, the infrastructure, the base, the foundation, the walls that were built to expand the size of the temple courts by King Herod. Now, I'm no expert in this, but that's the information I ran across. So there you go.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
If I might, I would also comment on the jealousy problem. I don't see, there's several places where God is a jealous God. He does not want them going after false gods. And that's all I read into that. It's not where it may be an undesirable thing in me, it was a desirable thing in God.
I think that's a good comment. Yes, and the jealousy being a rejection of all others is certain. You're right. That is certainly valid and wonderful for us. Um, okay. All right. All of you look okay. Gary.
Yes, one other thing about the your comment about the Shekinah apparently is not mentioned in this rededication of the second temple. Uh, I believe it's not mentioned because God didn't put Himself in this temple. At least the Scripture doesn't say He did. In the original, it says, "I'm going to dwell there among you." Um, so there's been a paradigm shift from the concept of where is God and where does He dwell. Now he's in Babylon as well as Jerusalem. Now he's in other places. He's not just stuck, if you will, in the temple in Jerusalem. So I think that's part of God's teaching again about other nations, and this is moving on. We're not going to go back to the same as it was. It's different now. But also the reason, if that were true, why have a temple at all? It wasn't just for the psychology of the people. This too is part of God's plan, where He says there will be no sacrifices anywhere except the tent of meeting, which later became called the tabernacle, which was substituted by the temple. And without that temple, there could be no sacrifices. That would include up to and including the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ as the Passover lamb. So there had to be a temple as far as God's plan was concerned, as far as what the people understood of that plan. Obviously, God's God, He could do whatever He wanted, but the psychology was there needed to be a temple, because that's how we offer sin offerings. That's our Thanksgiving offerings. That's our peace offerings. They could not be done otherwise or in other places.
Yeah, I ran across a passage. Uh, Let me just read this to you. The temple teaches the people about Christ, uh, Christ who will tabernacle among His people, John 1. Um, Christ who will offer the once for all sacrifice, that's Hebrews 7:27, and Christ who will mediate between God and man as the perfect high priest, Hebrews 7:15, 16. So we'll stop there. The temple is critically important for a variety of reasons. Oh, Scott, did you want to say something?
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I know we're over time, and this is probably apropos of nothing, but when you were saying that you went around and looked up little hints of what the exiles temple looked like, the first thing that came to my mind was the scene in the New Testament whenever the apostles they're walking away from the temple and they're remarking about it. And they say, see all these the great stones, I think they said, and these buildings. And then he said, it's all going to come down. But that just another hint, I guess, of what it looked like.
Yeah, and they're looking at Herod's temple. So, there are three temples. There's Solomon's temple, there's the rebuilt temple, and then there's Herod the Great's temple. And we're going to talk more about Herod the Great's temple later, but that's what they're looking at, and that's what's destroyed later. So, yes, I know I'm over time. I'll stop. We'll pick up next week on more of this. See you then.